All right, we will go ahead and get started. Again, welcome everybody. It's nice to see all of you here. Welcome to today's NITECAP speaker series on planning for nightlife and entertainment, promoting nightlife culture and great places. I'm Sarah Hannah Spurlock. I am a founding member of the Nighttime Economy Culture and Policy Alliance, and I will be kicking off today's what will prove to be an engaging and insightful discussion. Our speaker series is a bi-monthly deep dive into the issues facing our cities regarding good nighttime governments. Today's series is our third. You can see the first two on our YouTube channel. There is a link, or there will be a link in the chat to our link tree, which includes all kinds of wonderful resources, including our YouTube channel. But it's also got our website, our social media handles, all kinds of good stuff. Our policy papers, lots of good stuff. So be sure to click on that link tree to get all that good information. In addition, before we start, I want to encourage everyone listening to join NITECAP if you haven't already. You can also access that membership page from our website, which, as I mentioned before, is accessible from Linktree. Our rates are very affordable. Our primary goal is engagement and interaction and just nurturing and promoting good nighttime governance. We're not about making money. We're about paying our expenses and building this platform. So I encourage you and welcome you to join NITECAP. As cities continue to grow and evolve, so does the role of nightlife and entertainment in shaping a city's culture, economy, and overall vibrancy. But supporting independent nightlife scenes requires thoughtful planning, balancing economic development with community needs, and at times, addressing the challenges of creating safe and inclusive spaces. Today, I'm excited to introduce two incredible speakers who are at the forefront of these efforts. Brian Block is a founding member of NITECAP and current board member who is currently serving as our treasurer. Brian recently wrote a paper on our topic today, which he'll be talking a lot about today, I'm sure. Nicole Klepadlo is the executive director of the Red River Cultural District in Austin. She works to preserve and enhance the cultural and music scenes that make Austin's nightlife world-renowned. They will share their expertise on how cities can foster creativity, remove hurdles for independent venues, and help local talent thrive. Whether you're working in an urban planning, local government, or the private sector, the lessons from Austin's approach can provide valuable insights for your communities. If you have any questions throughout this speaker series today, please enter them in the chat and we will respond to them. We'll spend the last 15 minutes or so addressing your questions. So let's dive in and explore how we all can support independent nightlife, preserve our unique cultural spaces, and create great places that resonate with anyone. So Brian, I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for that great intro. Very excited to be here. Again, my name's Brian Block. I'm one of the founders and a current NITECAP Alliance board member. We're going to be talking about the policy paper I wrote that Sarah described, Planning for Nightlife and Entertainment and Promoting Nightlife Culture and Great Places. So we're going to be looking through a planning and placemaking lens. I'll have more intro on the paper, but before we do, super excited to have Nicole here, one of my favorite people and someone with a depth of experience on managing small business districts, consulting with other cities on placemaking and economic development and managing the Red River Cultural District. But Nicole, I'll turn it over to you and just to introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Brian, and thanks everyone for being here. This is a really exciting topic. This webinar kind of gives me an opportunity to kind of nerd out a bit with Brian and hopefully the information we share. But I come to this space with over a decade of experience with working in local government and nonprofits, looking at and really examining cultural districts, business districts, thinking about these destinations that provide a space for not only the nightlife economy, but really for communities, culture and commerce to thrive through that lens of not only tourism, but also how do we evaluate places as communities continue to change, and how do we craft policy and craft programs to help support these really valuable assets that help create a great community and make your communities attractive. And so I'm excited to be here today and dive into, I'm really a solution oriented person, so diving into those solutions that might be applicable to your community.
That's perfect, Nicole. The point of these webinars is to, take a paper or take a presentation and bring it to life and have some conversation about it. And with a focus on, getting granular, talking about solutions, coming from a practical perspective that can be kind of useful across different cities and different communities. So great intro. That's exactly what we're here to do. Before we dive into more details, I'll just give a real brief overview of the policy paper. You can see it in the chat. There's a link to it. But I'm now preaching to the choir on this first bullet point, but nightlife culture and its importance. Of course, I've got to start with at least one statement there. It supports a city's economy and culture and community. I think that's why everybody's here. They understand the importance of it, but got to at least mention it. But I think beyond that, from a planning and placemaking perspective, it makes cities unique and neighborhoods great places. And so I think that's a link to the planning lens. The paper kind of discusses how nightlife culture is created by music and culture and hospitality businesses and artists and musicians and creatives. And that whole ecosystem, supporting that whole ecosystem is important, but especially the independent businesses and artists and promoters. They're both the primary driver of nightlife culture, and they're kind of on the margins, unfortunately, and the most challenged often to kind of get started and sustain businesses and careers. So, the paper focuses on the need to ensure that nightlife can thrive in cities with that special focus on independence, and that we look at planning policies and how they can allow and encourage that to flourish, and that they don't create unnecessary barriers. So we're still high level here. I did want to go over what kind of the main points of the paper. And Nicole, before we get into kind of our more detailed discussion, I just wanted you to have a chance, kind of anything you wanted to add on the overall topic. I know you know so well what makes a great district, the importance of small businesses and independent venues. How important is this? And, maybe what are some of the unique challenges that those small and independent businesses face?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when we're talking about the larger ecosystem, like on the broader topic of nightlife culture, it really actually demonstrates this really complex interconnectedness, right? And I mean, we're really talking about what I refer to as the 3 C's, like community, commerce, and culture. And every community, and looking at the scale of who we have on the call, I mean, you might be coming from a bigger community or a smaller community, but scale is, cultural districts and looking at nightlife culture doesn't necessarily have to happen citywide, right? We can think about it in small destination places. And so when you think about the 3 C's, community, commerce, and culture, community is the people and the players, specifically the individuals that bring and contribute to your place. And commerce is really the craft and vision of the entrepreneurs that are embedding this competitive edge into your community and essentially positions your community to be something that is something and distinctive that another community is not, right? And I think when we talk about nightlife culture and we talk about destinations and placemaking, we really are honing in on what makes your community thrive and what makes your community different than the one next to it. Commerce also is a big piece of the market economy that positions your nightlife to be successful. And I stress that because every community, as we've gotten out of COVID, has seen different changes, different patterns, different trends. And then lastly, the culture. I mean, like, culture is such a broad word. And when I think about it, I think of heritage, I think of brand, diversity, an attitude, a vibe, a philosophy. And really, it's this creative fabric that is kind of that undeniable layer to your place. But I think the big question is how, right? I mean, how do we successfully knit these things together to create these places that bring economic value, that put, sales tax and mixed beverage tax and property tax into your city's ether, and how do we create these spaces that people are attracted to? And I think we're going to dive into some of that today, which is really exciting. But yeah, I think, the way we lay it out is, I encourage everybody today too, to not think of it as like it's a one solution base. I always kind of refer to it as, you got to be flexible and you got to be nimble. But it's like the tentacles of an octopus. Like, there's so many ways to approach nightlife culture, and it's an exciting topic, but it's complex, and we have to be willing to kind of dive into different approaches and different strategies.
That's fantastic. So much of what you said, resonated with me. The interplay between, of course, community and culture, and there's, art and music and creation, but the commerce matters as well, right? A lot of these are commercial businesses. They need to thrive economically as well. That's interesting. I know we'll get more into that. And, just how the nightlife culture is unique to your city, and to kind of dive into that and really nourish that. I think that also really resonated with me. So just as we stay on the bigger picture, I think those elements are really thoughtful and something that folks ought to think about.
Yes, absolutely.
So we're gonna get, we promised we were gonna get more granular. We were gonna talk about practical. So our first kind of thing, and this is touched on in the paper, is, I guess, still the paper focuses on how planning can create unnecessary barriers. And so it looks at, for example, land use and zoning policies. How can we have land use and zoning that doesn't create those barriers, that encourages and allows these creative nightlife businesses and districts to form organically and be sustained? So one of the things in the paper that it looks at kind of parking and zoning, and the reason is because we're both based here in Austin, but this is much broader than just Austin. But I've seen, just from my perspective here, what a big barrier. I think those historically, from my perspective, have been kind of two of the biggest barriers for new independent venues and hospitality businesses, bars, multi-use kind of creative spaces. Downtown here, that's not been a big issue because you can pretty much do anything you want in terms of uses in most of downtown, and we haven't had parking minimums or requirements downtown here. But outside of downtown, historically, a lot of parking was required.
Yeah.
And special zoning to be a bar, which was pretty much anything that would serve alcohol that wasn't a restaurant.
Mhm.
So, and this is much broader than Austin. I think when we look at larger cities, New York, Seattle, San Francisco, I doubt that they've had parking minimums ever. I don't know, but smaller cities and communities do, and they still have them.
Yeah.
Zoning, I think, is an issue across most cities and communities. So the paper covers how here in Austin, a couple of things have happened. One is parking minimums have been removed throughout the city. So the only parking required is what the business thinks it needs.
Yeah.
And then zoning wise, we've had a new land use created.
Yeah.
And it's for performance venues, music, comedy, other types of cultural performance. And it doesn't require that special bar zoning.
Mhm.
And so, I think that's a huge improvement. I guess I'll mention one more thing in Philadelphia. Similarly, they had a lot of things that had to be defined as a nightclub, which put a lot of limits on where that could go. They've revised that. They've kind of loosened that up, and not everything has to be defined as a nightclub anymore. I think these changes are a huge improvement. I think they are kind of groundbreaking, but they're also not a silver bullet.
Yeah.
I'm interested from your perspective, have you seen this as a challenge, either in Austin or in cities you consult with? Do you think these are going to make a positive impact, and kind of what barriers might still remain?
Sure, Brian, that's a really great question. I think bringing it up back to kind of the 300,000 foot level, one of the things I would say is it's been interesting and I'll talk about Austin for a minute. It's been really interesting to kind of follow a decade, and be involved in a decade worth of work where it feels very piecemeal, right? It feels like we are focused on financial, regulatory, and programmatic ways to support the nightlife economy. And there's not really been a roadmap or a journey. And now on paper, I know what that roadmap and journey has looked like. But there's one thing I would say is there has to be an intentionality component of this work. And if your community is really interested in fostering this kind of nightlife economy, I really encourage you to kind of get to the cores of what your goals are. And Brian, this parking component and the zoning component are just two elements, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think to your question of, is this going to challenge things, or is it, enhancing things? One thing we're seeing dramatically is, in the downtown area is rents are higher, property taxes are higher. So we are strategically trying to figure out, if we lose a venue in our downtown space, is there an opportunity for them to relocate? And, the recent advancements that have happened in Austin of creating a land use definition for what a performance venue is so critical to trying to understand, like, where can these things exist now in the city? And there's been a lot of work on identifying areas within the city that now would allow these performance venues to be in those spaces that likely would not have happened before. And that's a huge win. That's a huge win because what the city is saying is, we recognize there's a problem with affordability. We recognize there's a problem with retaining spaces in areas that have, higher market value, higher market potential. And they're creating other alternatives so that we don't lose this fabric. We will still be challenged with new challenges once they move outside the city's core. And parking is one of them, right? And we have some venues right now that don't have, parking to accommodate the patrons, and they're located in a neighborhood area, which is really fascinating because we also have challenges like residential parking permits. So if somebody's coming to a venue, and one of the solutions here, I feel like, is, the city has got to get to that granular case by case level and make a commitment to these venues to say, you are a value to us, you are an asset to us. Let's talk about operations. Let's talk about where your delivery trucks load in and load out, where your musicians load in and load out, and where are people parking, where are they coming from, and creating these kind of synergistic opportunities with a neighboring parking garage, or creating these these opportunities where they have potentially reduced parking minimums, not viewing it as a negative, but also looking at it as an opportunity to kind of elevate other opportunities. And so I do think, with every good comes, another challenge. And I think both of what the city of Austin has just done has been, really a step in the right direction. But also, if we're thinking about fostering, it goes back to that intentionality of, it's not going to be a one size fits all. And if a business now is struggling because of these limitations or because of these changes, I really believe it's on then the community to dive in deeper to try to figure out how they can support them. We also know that some venues right now that are outside the city limits, the parking that they have is not substantial enough to house the capacity, and so we really got to think about those transportation alternatives. We have to think about ride share. We have to think about some of those other things that can help support a venue outside of the downtown core.
That's really excellent. So many great points. I think, the intentionality is really important. And I think cities like Austin and Philadelphia and others are taking those steps and saying, we need to make it easier for these types of cultural businesses and venues to locate.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to create a land use that's easier to get, open up properties where you can put them, reduce those parking requirements. But what it does, and you so pointed out, is it opens up an opportunity to be more creative about the solution. And then we have to take that next step, like you said, and okay, now parking sharing agreements are on the table. They were so difficult to get approval for before. But, these nightlife businesses operate at night. How much parking is available off street nearby that they might be able? Is that city owned? Is that nonprofit owned? Is that other private businesses? It just opens up an opportunity to be more creative.
Yeah, there's a level of flexibility that is required here, right? There's a level of, let's try it and see if it works. One thing that, kind of in this same kind of, how do we support, musician parking? The city of Austin did launch a musician parking pilot program for downtown. We're working out the kinks. That's what I will say is, it's a different audience to think about. It's when they arrive at work and when they leave at work, it's different hours than if you were accommodating an office building. And so getting into that granular of what is actually needed, and then trying to figure out how can we make it, how can we, meet that need with being flexible and creative to some of these solutions.
Right. And that's that issue on musician parking is something other cities are dealing with. I'm not sure if they're on this call, but Seattle is working on it, and Nashville has raised it as an important topic. And so this crosses, across many cities and communities. So same kind of line of thinking, but kind of switching gears slightly. So we talked about easing zoning restrictions, reducing parking requirements. the performance venue land use in Austin and the revision to the nightclub in Philadelphia and things other cities are doing. That doesn't cover necessarily other types of innovative nightlife culture uses. In Austin, I'm thinking of a vintage bookstore with a wine bar. Shouldn't that be easy to create and locate? And then the other kind of topic that the paper goes into is, we still require conditional use permits, which, you have to go to have a public hearing and go to planning commission. And, it's the paper's not saying we should do away with them. Those maybe are still useful to manage conflicts, but I think where the paper is going is let's lean towards allowing more kinds of nightlife uses and activities, and allowing them without conditional use permits where appropriate. And the reasoning behind that is because often the way in other cities and special use permits, cities have different ways to do this, and they're attempting to manage operational conflicts through a conditional or special use. They're really not good at that. They're too static for that. And it does seem like there's a place for them, but sometimes they're overly broad and they really just, are a place for people to oppose nightlife activity or use. And it prevents it from starting up. Or sometimes they're just way too specific and they get into all this operational detail that you then would have to go back to the planning commission to change. Like, it seems like we could do that more through operational administrative nightlife management strategies. One of them that, and this is just one, but one that's pointed out and that we can talk a little bit about in cities like Austin and San Francisco have a big focus on this. Let's not manage sound with our conditional and special use permits. We can do that with being more agile with administrative solutions and proactive sound management. San Francisco has this, and Austin just did it, requiring sound assessments for new residential when it is built near a bar, club, or venue. So, what do you think? What's the kind of impact on the ground of these kinds of conditional use permit requirements? And do you think things like San Francisco and Austin and managing sound administratively, are these solutions that can help small hospitality businesses? Do you think these are applicable across different cities and communities?
That's a good question, Brian. I think, one of the things that we struggle with a conditional use permit is, it feels temporary. It feels like the conditions change with the wind. It feels like there becomes this lack of intentionality of, are we committed to nightlife culture or are we not? And if we are, then let's put policy in place that allows these types of uses to happen in different spaces and work on the things like compatibility and sound and parking adjacent to allowing such a use. And so I think, we know the city of Austin just passed this great, resolution that we now have. It formulates this ability to say, like, music venues do exist here. And when you are building next to our, this music venue, like, we view you as equal. We view you as you're both important components of this community. And that's saying something. That's committing to this intentionality of you are fostering this nightlife community, right? And I think the challenge with conditional use permits is that they try to stuff a lot of the operational management into that. And that's a separate thing. I think some of the things that can that can be resolved is, do you have a nightlife manager or a mayor, right? We've seen a lot of communities head in that direction. Do you have an active team with these, tools to go out and measure sound and actually see, are people being compliant? Is it a real issue? We worked really carefully over the last decade with community members that were claiming that, sound was happening, 2 miles north of our cultural district. And I will say, we walked into meetings where people thought, they were each other's worst enemies. And at the end became very, very friendly and understanding of the business, but also, the piece of a resident. And I think, these are some of those success stories, but I think oftentimes communities are afraid of committing to that granular of a level. And I will tell you, the communities that I've worked in, the ones that have been most successful, if they are using a conditional use permit to make this venue happen, they are then deploying these other tactics to actually dive into how can this be compatible? How can we work adjacent to this venue to make sure that they're positioned to be successful? And it requires this case management in some sense of committing to these spaces. And I know we can't do that with every business in the city. I mean, particularly some of our larger cities. But if you're looking at place, and this is the other thing, like we were talking about, allowing venues in different spots of Austin or different spots of your community. It is a commitment to that place. And with that comes, the need for regulatory, financial, and programmatic approaches that then foster that place. And I think, in the work that I've done, place management is kind of what is the first umbrella to making sure you have this, this fabric that fosters the nightlife economy and these venues that are locating into these spaces, because singularly they can't survive, right? And I think we're seeing that is, if you put a venue in one location, its ability to flourish and generate revenue is less unless it's surrounded by compatible uses. And I think that's something too to think about in communities where you're allowing these conditional use permits. Like, are we allowing them in the right areas? Are they targeted areas of investment for the city? Is the city really committed to these places? And I think that's a hard question to ask, because not only is it, place making, it's a regulatory activity, and it's an investment activity, and I will speak from the Red River hat. Like, we've got some significant big developments about to happen around our cultural district, and there's an opportunity to leverage what our community currently has and adds value to. But if it's not done in a way where we are investing and leveraging that, we could lose some of those assets. And so it's a different way of thinking. And I also think traditionally, I don't know what folks' background is on the call, but I have a traditional planning background. But unless we start thinking about this approach through an economic lens, we're doing ourselves a disjustice, because the fact is our communities are growing, or in some communities, the areas that used to be hotspots are not hotspots anymore. And we really need to keep the pulse on the economic market. And so it seems like it's easy to be like, here's your conditional use permit. But I really think like there's this wraparound that has to happen with that permit that is bigger than just a space. It's a place, right? It's an investment in that location.
That's really fantastic. Two things I want to highlight. One, that kind of keeps us in this topic of conditional use permits and nighttime management, and then segueing to our kind of last main topic around cultural and nightlife districts. And
Yeah.
you really set up both of them really well. I thought what you said about, again, I think, I don't know if you use this word, intentionality.
Mm-hmm.
These businesses and this nightlife culture has a place, it belongs.
Mm-hmm.
We want it here. I don't know, the words you used were more eloquent, but I think that's the flavor of it, that we need to be intentional. We need to say that they belong, and then create the wraparound structure. That's really a lot about what nighttime management and nighttime governance is about.
Sure,
And
sure.
so the paper goes into that. So that means we wrap it around with proactive sound management. It
Mhm.
means we wrap it, and we're going to talk about this in the next section. We wrap it around in a nightlife or cultural district with management and planning focused on that district. Things like providing training and support and guidance to our operators, things like having mediation and problem solving.
Yeah.
New York is kind of was one of the leaders on that front. So I'm glad you mentioned it, because that's really one of the key points the paper was trying to make.
Yeah.
Let's allow these nightlife uses in more places. Let's not hold them back with land use zoning and conditional use permits, but let's be proactive about managing them. And I think that kind of takes us to our last main topic. And I'm glad, we have some time, and maybe we can go over a minute or two if we need to talk about cultural districts and nightlife districts and planning and management around those. You gave us a kind of an intro and a segue into it with your comments.
Yeah.
These are special and unique places for cities,
Mhm.
but fostering a thriving district requires more.
Yeah.
It requires a lot of intentionality and investment of both time and resources. And there's two things I wanted to kind of talk about with you, and I've heard you talk about this. On the one hand, how do we leverage the benefits of the district, whether that was created or organically, or that district was identified as a place that was going to be a unique brand and vibe? How do we leverage the benefits with support and planning, things like placemaking, streetscape and infrastructure improvements, support for district organizing, because
Yeah.
they need to organize themselves. And then the flip side, and you can talk about them together or separate, but in case you want to talk about them together, how do we reduce risks and conflicts? The need for kind of management, what happens on the ground at night, safety and security and mobility and the organization of the public space and harm reduction, things that go, it can't just be law enforcement and go well beyond law enforcement. I've heard you talk about both of these things, and feel free to take them separately or together.
Sure.
But what do you think from your long kind of standing work in this field?
Mhm.
How do you think about those two parts of it?
Yeah. I mean, first and foremost, if your community does not have a commitment to, we'll call them an overarching district framework, we got to get on top of that, because that in itself is, many states have cultural district programs and they get designated through the state. I will say through the city of Austin, and other communities, it's one thing to say you are locally designated cultural district, but what does that mean? Like, what does that mean from tiers of investment? What does that mean from commitments to a public-private partnership? And I think the city of Austin has dabbled in that. I know the city of Omaha is definitely focused on trying to identify those creative areas. And I think part of this is, it starts with that policy, right? It starts with that policy of X, Y, and Z equals a cultural district, right? And then from there, it's that programmatic component of organizing support. That's the best part. The organizing support is truly where you find your community leadership, because let's just be honest, any community member or city representation on this call knows that you certainly do not have the capacity to manage a district from a city perspective, and you really shouldn't. It should be the stakeholders on the outside that are driving and providing that leadership. So I think, leveraging the benefits of a district, I will say, I wish I wish the city of Austin was viewing us more as a public-private partnership. I wish they were seeing us more as a partner in a lot of ways. I see where districts like the Rhino District, a cultural district in Denver, you're really seeing that leveraging power there between not just development and redevelopment and making sure, the cultural nightlife is infused in that. So I will say that it goes back to that intentionality of making sure you're committing, your community is committed to these cultural and entertainment districts through policy. And there's a sample of this policy that's floating around with the city of Austin regarding a framework for districts. And I believe San Francisco has something similar. But I think, when you're talking about the benefits of a district, you're talking about destinations that may have a hotel, may be bringing, the heads and the beds, so your hotel occupancy tax. It's important to get into this granular level of understanding what is that economic impact that these areas are providing. That dollar amount or that number is your reference point of understanding that if we start losing these assets or we don't invest in these assets, there's going to be a trickle down effect. There's going to be a trickle down effect in terms of hotel stays and tourism and festivals, right? I mean, Austin has a huge festival network, but what happens if venues close? Do we still have, that ability to host these big festivals that are such an economic and cultural generator for our communities? And so I think, part of that is understanding not just the anecdotal, which, we hear a lot, is like people are emotionally attached to places. Their lifestyle is connected to these different experiences that nightlife provides. But it has to go beyond that. It has to get into the numbers so that, you really understand, from a tourism capacity and also economic capacity, like what these places have to offer. And Brian, to your point about, reducing conflicts, I think, you got to look at each one of these venues. And, Red River Cultural District is unique. We have over a dozen independent live music venues in a walkable district. I mean, it's a pretty fascinating, opportunity, but also presents challenges, right? I mean, it's all nightlife activity, right? How do we infuse other uses, right? And so when we talk about conflicts, our conflicts have been few, except for with a few hotels in terms of sound, and a few surrounding community members through an apartment building, but our conflicts have been minimal on the sound side because people know where they're going. But our conflicts have been large on the parking side. Like, where do people come and not spend $60 to park downtown and go see a show? Where do the musicians that are performing park to go perform in a space? And so those all root back to those programs that a community can develop and implement. And that programmatic side of things is so important. And there are models that people are doing. The streetscaping thing that you mentioned is really interesting. We've kind of warded off, and I've worked in other communities where there may be this very fancy plan for streetscapes. And I do love me a good conceptual drawing of a beautiful streetscape. We all do, right? But we really have to understand how that new streetscape concept actually interfaces with a venue or interfaces with these entities. Because between line queuing and deliveries and musician loading and unloading, your beautiful streetscape may not be compatible with what's on the ground. And so we've done, we've taken some strong approaches to saying, like, you're going to have to look at this on a case by case basis. And I don't know how we've been able to do that, but people are listening and understanding that there are challenges to just implementing like a top-down approach of like, this is what your area should look like. So there's this granular level that comes out of cultural district formation, where you're developing this leadership with the stakeholders that can really help infuse and inform like the place management component. And I want to touch on the safety and security and harm reduction component because
touch on it
quickly,
and then maybe we can keep going with this as we get into Q&A.
Sure.
But I do want to hear you for maybe a minute on this topic
partnerships, right? That's what I'm stressing is, understanding that nightlife economy has, it's robust, right? And we have to think about how are people remaining safe. And so there's a lot of partners out there that will come out and train staff. And if the city can be a steward for that, please do. Help provide that training of Narcan and harm reduction to those places, and also help those venue spaces provide more visible access to care if there is an incident in a space, because that is super duper important. People need to feel like they are safe when they're entering in these cultural districts or places of destination. And with so much going on related to, harm reduction and substance use, it's important that, the city is participating and being part of those solutions for these venues.
That's so great. We're going to go to Q&A, but, just what you said about making sure that you're collaborating with the district, obviously critically important. Every district is different within a city and across cities and communities, and city involvement as a partner in reducing conflicts and harm, absolutely essential. Just great points. And with that, I think Sarah's back to take us through questions. Hopefully we got some.
You do. And, I was getting lost in the conversation, and before I know it, it's, 3:15 my time. So, yeah, that was super, you two, and really interesting. And I learned a lot, not just about Austin, but just how we should be thinking about nightlife. I love the intentionality theme that you kept focusing on, Nicole. That was great. And what you were just talking about was a nice segue into one of the questions that was asked. Beyond nightlife businesses, what kinds of coalitions should we be building in communities to gain support for better nightlife planning?
Nicole, why don't we let you start with that one, if that sounds good to you. I think it's right up your alley.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things, so when I joined this, I'm a former City of Austin employee in the Economic Development Department. I've since moved on from there, but there's a program that we crafted called Solely Austin, and that's the organizing component, right? So I highly recommend that you are building coalitions of your business owners in these spaces. If it's 5, if it's 10, if it's 20, if it's 50, there needs to be a system, and the Solely Austin platform that I created at the City of Austin is that organizing mechanism. It's providing that organizing support so folks can build these sorts of business coalitions that really work in tandem with your nightlife economy. Frankly, they're one and the same. We've got a pizza place, plenty of food trucks in the cultural district, and anytime we host an event, we don't do it without them. We're promoting their specials. We're promoting what their features are. They're providing discounts, and those are all synergistic to making sure that place, there's more multiple things for people to do in these places. So focus on organizing your business community, your small business community, and if you have I like to call it like, who is the catalyst in the district? Like if you have a chain, whether it's a Walgreens, a CVS, a big business person, somebody that's not operating as a small business, tap into them. They can be a fantastic steward for sponsorships, for partnerships, for endorsements. And those really go a long way in terms of supporting an area.
And I'll talk a little bit about it from the NITECAP perspective and the nighttime management perspective. A big focus for NITECAP and for our approach to nighttime management is collaboration, is being a liaison, is being a facilitator of internal and external stakeholders, being someone who can listen carefully, who can understand the different perspectives, and try to build solutions and consensus. I think that's, we feature that a lot in, I think that's been part of a blog post. It was referenced in my paper. The nighttime management role, there's a lot to it, but a lot of it is supporting collaboration and coalition building, listening carefully, not trying to make that top down, but supporting the views and needs and interests of the different stakeholders. So I'll just give that NITECAP perspective and nighttime management plug for that question.
Great, great answers. We got another question here. How are cities working to ensure a diverse range of nightlife spaces and activities for various communities to enjoy? That inclusiveness of nightlife.
So I can start, Nicole, if you want, and you can have a second to think about it. I do think, the paper focuses on independent nightlife and hospitality businesses and how they are kind of most at the margins, most at risk, hardest to start up and sustain. So I think a lot of cities have a focus on small business during their daytime economy. And I think that needs to be carried over to the nighttime economy. That's a way to, there needs to be a focus on diversity and equity, but supporting small business, and then of course supporting small business with a focus on equity. I think those two things can ensure that we have a diversity of owners, of types of activities, of places where different communities are built in these spaces. So I feel like small business is important, and then a direct focus on equity and diversity as well. I think a lot of cities are doing that, but can they do that for nighttime economy as well? What do you think, Nicole?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that gets into the granular is the types of programming you're offering. And so one thing I would encourage, and I've done a lot of work in, is, your hotel occupancy tax money that comes in, cities allocate that in different ways, and understanding where that money goes is a really important component. I've seen communities more recently look at their hotel occupancy tax and think about how they can use that money to reinvest in what the hotel occupancy tax is generating. And so looking at grant funds that support musicians or artists in terms of genre development and artist development, and in what you'll start to see is through those programs and through that investment into those people, into those crafts, is contributing back into your market. And so what we look through those programs is really looking at different genres, different approaches to art, different approaches to music. And I think there's a level of diversity, equity, inclusion that goes into a lot of that programming. The other thing I would say is thinking about what these spaces have and provide. A lot of this is, are they offering opportunities for new artists? A lot of your venues or cultural spaces are really incubation networks to kind of climb that either audience ladder or marketing ladder, where they can go on to bigger and better places. And so when you think about the spaces that you have and the assets that you have, figuring out how you can support those spaces through incentivizing them. We have a couple new programs that are rolling out in Austin about, looking at incentives for new cultural spaces or relocation of cultural spaces. And I think when you start doing that, you're looking at the people and organizations that are most in need and making sure they have a home somewhere else in the community. And a lot of this is looking at nonprofit organizations that are supporting your nightlife community. I mean, that is a huge one. It's also getting to know who are the people that are nurturing your community in certain ways, and figuring out who their audiences are. I think that is a big piece too. In the cultural district, we know that we've seen, bands of all genres, all race, all ethnicity, all flavor, and thinking about how they're working their way through the cultural district to bigger venues and actually touring outside of the United States, which is a big piece of making sure that they're included in that opportunity to propel outside of our market.
That's great. And I before you go to the next one, I would be remiss if I didn't at least plug a little bit here Philadelphia, just because of the focus that they have and are working on in terms, you mentioned incentives, incentivizing small, diverse hospitality businesses and making it easy for them to start up, similar to what you said. Got to mention that plug for Philadelphia and that work they're doing.
So we've only got 2 more minutes, and we're going to be respectful of everyone's time. So we have probably more questions than we have time, and I offer to our panelists that we have these questions, and maybe we can respond to them offline in an email or some other sort of fashion, but I want to be respectful of time. So in 2 minutes or less, our final question: what do we mean when we say cultural district? Is that like a business improvement district, a zoning overlay, or something else?
Yes, great
Nicole,
question.
let's go to you first. This is, again, your lane, and I'll comment with the time that's left.
Yeah, great question. It could be all of the above. And when I say that is just saying it's a cultural district through some sort of council resolution is not enough. And so when you think about the mechanisms of forming a cultural district, the baseline of that is that you have that grassroots leadership from the people that consist of your cultural district. And then you think about the financing mechanism for these cultural districts, which could be a business improvement district or a public improvement district. There are a lot of ways to position a cultural district. You can infuse, a community can infuse it, in different ways. Each community I've worked with has either an appetite for certain level of incentives for cultural districts, or there's no appetite. And I think what you want to think about is, how are you creating a cultural district policy that leaves it regulatory, financially, and programmatic secure, and positions it in a way that it becomes a stable cultural district? And so that's a fantastic question. I'll tell you, the city of Austin has not done a great job of positioning their cultural districts in a way from a regulatory perspective, because we don't have overlays for protections. And right now we're just trying to figure out, we've got these 2 designations, local and state. And so really great question. A lot of opportunity when it comes to, crafting your local policy.
And
great, thanks, Nicole. Brian, just a few seconds to wrap up.
Okay, I won't say much on this, except just agreeing with Nicole that the programmatic and regulatory framework is there, and that it can be kind of crafted to what's needed. Each district is different and has different needs, and so it has to be agile, and so it can be created from the ground up based on what's needed. So I'll stop there, Sarah. I don't want to go over.
Again, we could probably talk about this all afternoon, I'm sure. So thank you all so much for attending. Again, this recording will be put up on YouTube also. Quickly before we close down, if you haven't linked to us on Linktree, where it's got all of our social media platforms, our policy papers, how to join NITECAP, I would encourage you to do so. Nicole, thank you so much for joining us. And Brian, thank you so much. That was such a great discussion from 2 rock stars in our nightlife planning industry. So thanks again, everybody, for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day and your upcoming weekend. And get out and see something live.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Really
Thanks
appreciate it.
for having me. It was been great. I wish we could talk longer, to be honest.
Let's do it again.
Thank you.